In the Middle Ages, your social class wasn't just your status. It was your shield against, or your target for, medieval justice. For nobles, a crime might mean a fine. For commoners, it could mean mutilation, the gallows, or worse. From the highest crime of treason to the pettiest offense of gossip, the medieval crime pyramid was built on inequality and fear. Let's uncover how justice, or injustice, truly worked in the medieval world. So let's start right at the top, the worst crime in medieval society: treason. It threatened the ruling monarch, the government, and the stability of the kingdom itself. It was considered an offense against lèse-majesté, an attack on the sovereign's authority, and was punished with extreme brutality. But what was considered treason? Well, we can break it down into three main types: political, economic, and authority treason. First, political treason. This is the most direct form of treason because it's against the ruler or state. It includes rebellion, aiding a foreign enemy, betraying your lord or kingdom, breaking oaths of loyalty, and crucially, plotting against the king. A clear example is Guillaume de Deke, mayor of Bruges. In 1328, he led an uprising against French rule. After his defeat, he was arrested for treason and received a harsh sentence. Both hands were chopped off, he was displayed in the pillory for a day, and then drawn and hanged in Paris. Then there's economic treason. Like today, medieval coinage was strictly controlled. Economic treason primarily involved forgery and coin clipping. Coin clippers shaved metal from coins to create counterfeits, which devalued the currency. In 1134, King Henry I of England, concerned about debased coinage, imposed a severe punishment on moneyers found guilty of coin clipping: the removal of their right hands and testicles. Finally, authority treason focused on undermining royal power directly. This is best exemplified by forging the king's seal. The royal seal authenticated royal orders and laws. Forging it was treason because it could disrupt royal administration and justice. A forged seal could create false decrees, manipulate the legal system, and illegally transfer wealth. Punishments for treason were designed to be maximally cruel and humiliating, intended to discourage others. In medieval England, the punishment of drawing and quartering was used for high treason. First, the condemned were tied to a frame and dragged by a horse to the execution site. Then, they were hanged until near death. While still alive, they were disemboweled, and the executioner would burn their intestines right in front of them. Following this, the criminal was beheaded and quartered, the body cut into 4 parts. Finally, the body parts were publicly displayed, often at city gates, as a warning. Some individuals accused of treason were able to defend themselves or gain royal pardons through various means. Nobles, for instance, could appeal to the king or leverage political alliances to mitigate their sentences. Occasionally, a ruler might grant a pardon in exchange for military service, a hefty fine, or an oath of loyalty. There were also cases where evidence of treason was deemed insufficient, leading to acquittals or reduced punishments. For example, during the Wars of the Roses, some nobles accused of treason were later restored to power when political tides shifted. Now, moving one level down in our medieval crime pyramid, we encounter religious crimes, which are heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy. These were considered exceptionally serious offenses, as they directly challenged the church's authority and the very foundation of the religious order that underpinned medieval society. Let's first consider heresy. This was arguably the most significant religious crime. Essentially defined as any belief or action that contradicted the official established teachings of the church, heresy was not just seen as a mistake or a difference of opinion. It was viewed as a deliberate act of rebellion against God himself, and therefore deserving of the worst condemnation. What kind of actions or beliefs were deemed heretical? Key examples included questioning the supreme authority of the Pope, attempting to translate the Bible into vernacular languages, denying core established Christian doctrines such as the Trinity or the concept of transubstantiation, and publicly preaching religious ideas that had not been officially sanctioned or approved by the church. Accusations of heresy were not always purely theological. Often, political motivations played a significant role, with the charge of heresy being used to silence or eliminate political opponents and those who challenged the church's considerable power. Next, we come to witchcraft. By the late Middle Ages, the perception of witchcraft had evolved, becoming increasingly intertwined with heresy and explicitly linked to the concept of devil worship. This association with Satan elevated witchcraft from perhaps a form of folk practice to a religious crime. Tragically, prevailing misogynistic views of the time played a crucial role in witchcraft accusations, with women being disproportionately targeted. They were often seen as more susceptible to demonic influence, making them prime candidates for accusations. But what constituted witchcraft in the eyes of the medieval church and society? Common accusations included the idea of individuals making pacts directly with the devil, engaging in maleficium or harmful magic intended to cause illness or misfortune, participating in imagined sabbats, secret gatherings where witches were believed to worship the devil, and having familiar spirits, demonic entities that supposedly assisted witches in their magic. Those most vulnerable to witchcraft accusations were overwhelmingly women, especially those already marginalized or outside of societal norms. Elderly women, widows, women living alone, or those practicing traditional healing. Often accusations stemmed from existing social tensions, personal disputes, or simply the desire to find a scapegoat for unexplained misfortunes. Finally, there was blasphemy and religious defiance. This category encompassed acts of publicly insulting or showing contempt for God, the saints, or other figures or objects considered sacred by the church. Examples of blasphemous acts include mocking the Holy Eucharist, openly denying the existence of God, or even using the name of Christ or other holy figures as curse words in public. Accusations of blasphemy could be leveled against anyone who overtly disrespected established religious norms, including religious reformers who challenged the church's doctrine and those who dared to criticize the church's vast wealth and political power. The punishments for all religious crimes were designed to be harsh and serve as a deterrent. The Inquisition's methods themselves were a form of punishment. Trials conducted by the Inquisition were characterized by a complete lack of due process for the accused. Individuals were not informed of the identities of their accusers, nor were they allowed to see the evidence presented against them. Torture was a standard and routinely employed method to extract confessions from the accused. Common torture techniques included the infamous rack, the strappado, the brutal iron boot, and water torture. For those convicted of heresy and witchcraft, the most common and symbolically charged punishment was burning at the stake. This gruesome form of execution was intended to be a public spectacle, serving as a stark warning to others, and was seen as symbolically purging heresy and witchcraft through fire. While burning was the standard, beheading was sometimes used for heretics of noble status, considering a slightly more honorable form of execution. For women specifically accused of witchcraft, the terrifying ducking or trial by water was sometimes employed. It was a horrific test where survival often meant condemnation and sinking often meant death by drowning. And even short of execution, excommunication represented a severe punishment, effectively casting an individual out of the church, leading to spiritual isolation, loss of legal rights within the community, and often forced exile. The entire system surrounding religious crimes was permeated by a climate of fear and hysteria. The church actively used these trials and punishments to maintain strict control over the population and suppress any deviation from religious orthodoxy. Public executions were deliberately staged to inspire terror and obedience. The use of anonymous informants fostered an atmosphere of widespread suspicion and paranoia where anyone could be accused. Tragically, a significant number of accusations were entirely fabricated, driven by personal vendettas or used as a means to eliminate rivals. Before we continue, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the world of medieval crime and punishment, make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps me bring more historical stories to life. Now, let's examine violent crime, focusing on murder and related offenses. Medieval law differentiated between homicide and murder. Premeditated murder, the most serious form, almost always resulted in execution. Manslaughter, which included accidental killings or those occurring in the heat of passion, might be punished with fines or exile, representing a less absolute form of justice. The severity of the crime escalated significantly when the victim was of high status. Killing a noble or royal official was considered exceptionally grave, almost akin to treason. The legal system even reacted strongly to the act of drawing blood, decreeing that if blood was spilled and the injured person died, the assailant would be arrested, judged, and executed for homicide. While self-defense could be considered a factor in lessening culpability, potentially leading to forgiveness, it required substantial proof presented in court. Even with a successful self-defense claim, fines or exile remained possible outcomes. The administration of justice was structured in layers, with local courts typically handling homicide cases unless appeals were made to higher authorities such as the parliament. This reflects the reality that not all homicide cases involve public elements, with many remaining within the scope of local jurisdiction. The treatment of violence differed significantly depending on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. For example, a noble who killed a peasant might only be required to pay blood money as compensation. However, if a commoner killed a nobleman, the punishment was harsher, generally culminating in execution. Although nobles were executed less frequently, they might be subjected to large fines, whereas commoners faced more brutal and publicly humiliating punishments such as drawing, mutilation, and the pillory, even though commoners were statistically executed slightly more often for offenses against nobles. Blood feuds and revenge killings were a recognized part of medieval society, particularly among the nobility. Revenge killings were sometimes implicitly tolerated, and in certain regions, weergeld, or blood money, was used as compensation instead of execution. However, punishment was also increasingly viewed as a tool of deterrence, aiming to set an example that would discourage future crimes. Punishments for murder were diverse and brutal. Hanging was the standard method of execution for commoners, often accompanied by gibbeting, where the body was left hanging as a public warning. Drawing and quartering was reserved for the most extreme murder cases, especially those involving noble victims, highlighting the extreme severity of crimes against the social hierarchy. Beheading was often considered a more honorable execution for nobles. Mutilation and branding, such as amputation or marking with hot irons, were employed to permanently identify criminals, effectively marking them for life. Imprisonment and hard labor were also used as punishments, and wealthy individuals sometimes could use their resources to secure life imprisonment as an alternative to execution. Trial by combat, a judicial duel, was sometimes used to resolve murder accusations, seen as a form of divine judgment, although women and clerics were exempt. Moving to the fourth tier, we address theft and highway robbery. These property and financial crimes, while less severe than treason or murder, were still harshly punished, especially highway robbery, which threatened trade and travel. Theft and larceny included stealing personal items, livestock, or food. Even minor theft like pickpocketing could be severely punished, as one record notes the escalating punishment. Minor thefts that did not initially warrant hanging, the culprit could lose his ear for the first offense. Upon the second, his foot, he should be hanged only after 3 infractions. Highway robbery, attacking merchants, travelers, and even royal messengers, was a major property crime. Organized gangs operated along roads, and shockingly, some royal officials were even involved. A vivid account describes an ambush in the Alten Pass in 1248, where merchants from Brabant were robbed of 200 marks by robbers and freebooters, some of whom were identified as members of King Henry III's court. Rustling and poaching, stealing livestock or game, were also serious. Poaching in royal forests could lead to execution, and rustling livestock was punished nearly as severely as murder due to the impact on livelihoods. Reflecting the severity of poaching, in 1390 Parliament limited the right to hunt to those who owned property worth at least 40 shillings. Peasants caught hunting faced execution. Medieval punishments for theft and robbery were brutal. Hanging was common, especially for highwaymen and major theft, becoming standard for most felonies by the 13th century. It was a time when, in some parts of England, thieves knew they could be hanged without further trial for stealing goods worth more than a shilling. Mutilation, including branding and amputation, was frequently used, especially for first-time offenders, with repeat offenders facing execution. The message was clear. Thieves might lose their covetous eyes or pilfering hands, and poachers could find their legs amputated. The pillory and stocks were used for public humiliation of petty thieves, who were often publicly mocked in town squares. Whipping and public beatings were also common for petty theft, As with other crimes, class and status heavily influenced punishment. A noble caught stealing might be fined or briefly imprisoned, while a commoner faced mutilation, branding, or execution. Moving to the fifth tier, we consider social crimes in medieval society. These were actions that, while not really violent, were seen as disruptions to social order and morality. These offenses disproportionately affected the lower classes. Vagrancy and begging were key social crimes. Medieval society made a clear distinction between those considered the deserving poor and criminal beggars. In 1349, the Statute of Laborers made it illegal for able-bodied men to beg instead of seeking work. Vagrants, defined as homeless wanderers, were perceived as threats to social stability and were consequently punished harshly. Historical accounts describe able-bodied beggars being punished by being scourged from town to town with a lash. Legislation from 1388 further mandated that while beggars unable to work should be allowed to remain in one place, any able-bodied person resorting to begging should face punishment. Debt and financial crimes also constituted social crimes. Debtors who lacked the means to repay their debts were often imprisoned for indefinite periods. While wealthier individuals might find ways to avoid punishment by paying fines, poorer debtors faced significant hardships. Debtors' prisons were frequently overcrowded and many inmates faced starvation if they could not afford to pay for their own food. It was common practice in medieval Europe for prisoners to be responsible for their own sustenance and bedding, and those without resources often starved as a result. Adultery and sexual misconduct were also categorized as social crimes, with a significant gender disparity in how they were treated. Adultery was considered a severe offense for women, while men often received more lenient treatment. Punishments for adultery varied across regions, but could include public whippings, exile, and in some instances, even death for women. Women found guilty of adultery also faced the possibility of losing their dowry and being forced into religious convents. Legal viewpoints of the time are reflected in statements asserting a husband's right to kill a man found in act of intercourse with his wife with impunity, while the wife herself would only be handed over to a judge. Punishments for these social crimes frequently involved public humiliation through devices like stocks and pillories. Public shame was the most common punitive measure for vagrancy, debt, and adultery. Offenders were often locked in stocks or pillories located in busy public areas, where they would be subjected to mockery. In some instances, offenders were also compelled to wear symbolic garments specifically designed to identify their crime to the public. For example, adulterers might be made to wear sackcloth and stand at the church door during Sunday services as a public display of their shame. The application of punishment for social crimes was significantly influenced by class and gender bias. For vagrancy, both men and women might face whipping and branding. In cases of debt, men typically faced imprisonment and fines, while women could be sentenced to imprisonment and exile. For adultery, men, especially those of noble status, might receive fines or exile, whereas women could face whipping, execution, or permanent confinement in religious institutions. Begging, when committed by men, might result in stocks and public humiliation, while women could face stocks and forced labor. This reflects a broader societal trend where men found guilty often received minimal punishment, while women were subjected to extreme public humiliation for similar offenses. Finally, reaching the very bottom of the medieval crime pyramid, we find petty offenses. These were acts considered disruptive to social order, but not directly life-threatening. Basically, public drunkenness, gossiping, disturbing the peace, and minor blasphemy. Public drunkenness, especially when it occurred in religious or official settings, was viewed as both immoral and disruptive. Church laws strictly prohibited drinking during services, and those who violated these rules could face time in the stocks or fines. For individuals who repeatedly engaged in public drunkenness, punishments could escalate to public whippings, or in extreme cases, even exile. This is underscored by historical enactments stipulating that individuals convicted of drunkenness should be fined 5 shillings or spend 6 hours in the stocks. Gossip and scolding, offenses primarily applied to women, involved behaviors like spreading rumors, nagging husbands, or causing public disputes. Being labeled a scold was almost exclusively a female designation, effectively reinforcing gender roles within medieval society. Public shaming and devices such as the scold's bridle, specifically designed to silence women deemed outspoken, a device that was locked around a woman's head to prevent gossiping or nagging, were employed as deterrents against such behavior. Disturbing the peace, basically brawls, excessive noise, and general disruptions in public areas, like markets and churches, was also subject to punishment. Tavern brawlers and street fighters could face fines, time in the stocks, or whipping. In some cases, offenders were compelled to make public apologies within the church itself. A common punishment for minor offenses such as resisting a constable was the stocks, requiring the offender to attend morning prayer in church, publicly apologize, and then remain in the stocks until evening prayer concluded. Punishments for these petty offenses were primarily focused on public humiliation. The stocks and pillories were the most frequently used instruments deployed for minor offenses in public squares where offenders were intentionally placed to be publicly mocked. The ducking stool was specifically reserved for women accused of gossip or public disorder, involving repeated submersion in water, which was rationalized as a means to cleanse the offender. Whippings and beatings were used for repeat offenders of petty crimes such as disturbing the peace. Fines and public penance provided alternative forms of punishment, especially for wealthier individuals who had the means to pay fines or undergo public repentance. Medieval crime, medieval punishment, brutal, public, and unequal. The crime pyramid reveals a world where justice was a tool of control and fear was the law. Check out my sources below. See you in the next one.